Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our follow-up panel on old growth forests. What is the path forward? So my name's Sally Aiken. I'm a UBC alumna from 1984, and I'm currently professor in forest and conservation sciences, and I'm also Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Forestry. And it's really my pleasure to be here for a follow-up conversation. Last time around, we had excellent presentations, but we didn't have much time for discussion of the many questions that came in from the audience. So before we get started today, I want to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver campus, where I am today, is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And UBC Okanagan is on the traditional territory of the Sailks people, the Okanagan Nation. I know that people are joining us from all over the province and probably outside the province as well. And so I want to recognize the traditional caretakers of the land that you are on. And you can go to nativeland.ca if you want to know more about the traditional territory and the people on whose land you are living and working. So our first conversation was on April 7th. We had a large audience and we had really interesting presentations from our four panelists. We received over 70 questions from audience members, and because we didn't have time to discuss those, we were really happy that we could reconvene 3 of our 4 panelists here today. Unfortunately, Chief Councillor Robert Dennis of the Huayet Nation was unable to join us again today, but you can watch his presentation and the presentations of the other panelists from our April 7th discussion through a link that should have been sent to all of you who were registered for the first round of the panel. So now I'll introduce our panel members. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Cam Brown. So Cam is one of our alumna from 1993. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Forestry degree. He also holds a degree from Oregon State University, master's degree, and he's a registered professional forester in BC and in Saskatchewan. He's been working in the forestry sector for 25 years in Western Canada, and he currently manages Foresight Consultant Limited's Resource Management and Technology Business Unit. And it offers analytical and planning services to the Canadian forest industry. Our next panel member is Dr. Rachel Holt. Rachel holds a PhD from the University of Toronto, although she spent quite a bit of her time during that degree at UBC, and she works as an independent ecologist. She's worked on the ecology and management of old growth forests for over 25 years, and she sat on the BC Forest Practices Board for 6 years, 2 of which she served as vice chair. And she was recently a member of the BC Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel. Our third and final panelist is Gary Merkel. Gary's a registered professional forester, and he beats all of us because he's got over 45 years of experience in forestry in BC. And he was a member of the 2-person independent panel that reviewed BC's old growth strategy, and he's currently a member of the Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel. I really recommend that audience members interested in old growth issues in BC read the reports that Gary and his co-panel member Al Gorley produced as a result of their review, because they go in depth into a lot of the issues involved, and they talk to many, many people across the province to get their people's opinions, perspectives, values around old growth, and summarized that huge amount of information, put it into 14 recommendations. So So today's structure is going to be a little bit different than the last one that we had. And I just need to get to my right document here. So last time around, as I said, we had over 70 questions, and many of those received many votes from the audience members. So we've identified 10 of the top questions that many of the audience wanted to hear answers on. And one of those in particular, I want to highlight right off the bat, because I think we've had some exciting work between two of our panel members to address it. So they know what the questions are, and we sent these questions around, and then they did some work on them. So this first question today, do Cam and Rachel think they would be able to work together to eventually agree on describing the current status of rare/high value old growth in the province? We expanded that to say, what are the points of agreement? It's really easy for us to focus on the points of disagreement, or points where analyses don't line up, or points where perspectives don't line up, but what's the common ground? And so now Rachel and Cam are going to give us a brief presentation on the points of common ground. So with that, I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So Cam and I mean, it's not like this is the first time we've talked to each other. We have known each other and worked together to lesser and greater degrees over many years. And so we were happy to have this opportunity to kind of get out of the position of being dueling around this and put together some thoughts of where we agree. And we've put together a little one pager that we're just going to share with you now and work through. It's not particularly organized in some senses because we've done this over the last 24 hours. And so we just pull this together and put it in these slides, which we'll go through and basically just work through them. We haven't talked about how to do this, so I guess we'll just take it in turns. Cam, if that makes sense.
Yeah, go for it, Rachel.
So both of us can speak to this. You know, we put this first bullet slide together because although we have produced reports in the last while that suggest something different, what we actually both think is that change is needed, that status quo management of BC's old forest has gaps that need to be addressed, and new strategies are needed to address the recommendations in the old growth strategic review. So neither of us thinks nothing needs to change. We think they do need to change, and we think the goal is to promote healthy, resilient ecosystems as the objective. That was point number one. It seems really crucial to come to that because you could infer that's not the case based on some of the previous work that's gone around. I'm sorry, and I hadn't put this into slideshow mode, so I will do that now, just so that it's easier to read. All right, so that's that one. And I'm sorry there's lots of words in this, but we have spent quite a bit of time thinking about these words. And if you want to take the lead on this one, Cam.
Sure. I think we both agree that the assessing risk to biodiversity is really a function of looking at how much exists relative to expected or natural levels of old forest. So as that level of deviation from natural expected amounts of old increases, so does the risk to biodiversity. Low levels of old forest also make ecosystem less resilient to changing climate. So we have concerns around very low levels of old growth for sure. When we think about how do we define thresholds around that, the idea of defining a specific threshold is pretty challenging. Specific thresholds for risk or geographic scales to assess risk will vary based on the stand types or the natural disturbance patterns in a given ecosystems. So for some ecosystems, 30% of natural or more may be required to address even a high risk threshold. whereas in others, lower levels of old forest may be possible before triggering that high risk status. I think it's also worth pointing out that managing for ecological health, as outlined in Gary's report, will require us to manage not just for high risk thresholds, but to manage for a range of risk levels across the land base. Minimum levels of old forest, absolute minimums are a pretty important key. So maybe it's not just about percent of natural at sometimes, but the absolute level of minimum is a critical thing to think about, in particular as it relates to connectivity and maintaining that function across the land base. And risk to biodiversity can also be mitigated through how we manage the matrix around these retention areas. So by retaining biological legacies and structure within harvested areas, we can also help to reduce the risk to biodiversity. So both landscape and stand level management strategies are required to help address risk to biodiversity.
All right, so managing for big tree old growth. We concluded that all sizes of old forest are important, but big tree stands are currently underrepresented on the land base. And managing for that is critical to ensure representation of a full range of stand sizes in old forest retention areas. And because large treed old growth stands have been disproportionately logged, I'm trying to just move the little bar so I can actually read the words here. Because large treed old growth stands have been disproportionately logged, it's important to weight these more heavily in retention strategies. The goal is to ensure that representation considers what was originally present and not just based on what remains today. Somebody really wants to call me, apparently. Sorry about that. And tree sizes is really important, but it's only one of the considerations for old forest retention strategies. Retention areas should be selected to support maintenance of biodiversity versus simply putting them in places that minimizes timber supply impacts. So that's right in alignment with the OGSR recommendation. And deferring harvest in very large, rare stand types is important in the short term to maintain options.
And I think both of our reports highlighted there was roughly about 1 million hectares of old growth in the province, which represent about 21% of our forested lands. And to put that into context, and some of the questions we're asking about this, it's roughly half, 45, 50% of what might have been here hundreds of years ago. So we certainly have less old growth today than we would have had historically. Provincial level, but these provincial level numbers really don't help us to understand risk to biodiversity. There's been a lot of focus on these provincial level numbers, and we're trying to move away from those and get down into the weeds, because that's where the real assessments are made. It's necessary to look at each ecosystem and the distribution of stand types and sizes within it to understand risk. Today, the highest productivity areas in any ecosystem often have much smaller proportions of old forest remaining than the lower productivity areas. And it's important to determine where that's occurring to come up with appropriate retention strategies. The biggest stands in any ecosystem are naturally rare, though. And so forest harvesting has often made them even more rare. It's important that we identify and retain these large stands based on historic abundance of these stand types.
Height and diameter are the best metrics in the vegetation resources inventory, the strategic level inventory that's available to identify these stands. The technical advisory panel created a map 8, which looks at provides a provincial map on all the old growth in the province, organized into 5 size categories that used height and diameter specific to every ecosystem, defining that as Beck variant. And so that map is available if people aren't aware of it on the provincial website. And describing how much of BC's current old forest is big requires a subjective definition of height or diameter. And that does need to be done by ecosystems, by the specific ecosystem, and different definitions will produce different answers.
And I think we talked a bit about this idea of protected lands versus non-THLB lands, and agreed around this idea that obviously protected areas and non-timber harvesting land base are different, and they don't confer the same level of protection for old forests. Commercial logging cannot occur in protected areas, but it can occur in the non-timber harvesting land base. It's just a lot less likely by definition. That's how we create the non-THLB. But I think it's important to recognize that the non-THLB shouldn't be considered representative of the land base as a whole either. So there's some important considerations there.
All right, that was our list of bullet points that that we came up with, and we hope that's helpful in the sense of although we've done different analyses doing different data sets, we're actually in quite strong agreement in the big picture about what needs to happen and how you might do that. So we can start with that and move forward from there. Thanks, Sally.
So thanks very much for that, Rachel and Cam. I think that's just really illuminating about how much ground there is for agreement, and also that supports the recommendations that came out of the Old Growth Strategic Review. Gary, would you like to comment on any of that?
Yes, I think so, because I just want to reinforce the need to change. In our outreach process, I personally can only recall one individual who said everything is fine and we don't need to change out of the few thousand people we talked to. And he was quite ignorant about it. The forest sector is just fine. The kind of stereotypical person that you might think is out there, but we only ran into that with one person out of numerous forest sector interviews from all walks, and everybody there was in the same boat. All the municipal governments were, everybody was in there. It's the transition part that is really hard, and how to get from here to there. How do we bring everybody in? How do we have everybody involved? And what this particular little thing between Cam and Rachel says to me is that we still don't totally know how to manage for ecosystem integrity. And we have a lot of good ideas, and our system is not built to support that. Our inventory is not built to support that, our planning frameworks, etc. And those are things that we have to work through. But you know what it does for me also is it confirms that we all have the same idea, and we might have some different thoughts on some of the details, but we're all working to the same thing, and we can work those things out. I know we can work these. I've seen every place I've seen where people have put their minds to this, they have figured it out. So good on it.
Great comments. And I think a positive perspective as we move into change, although change is always hard and disruptive for many people. So just to follow up a little on some of the issues around understanding the extent of old growth, could each of you who would like to just talk a little bit about how we should be defining old growth? The strategic review avoided using a definition of old growth because this is such a challenging topic, but maybe you could talk a little bit about age versus size. And in what you just presented, you've pointed out that size is an easier metric to use in the inventory database, but just speak to the importance of those criteria. Cam, do you want to start on that?
Sure, I can take a shot at that. It's a challenging question, and you have to think about what the context you're going to use it in. If we have to do something provincially or even regionally, we only really have one option, and it is the age and the BRI. Ideally, we would have LiDAR, and we could think about structure. Because I think most people who work in old growth and understand that there's been lots of work done to create scorecards for old growthiness, because it's a continuum. It's not a black and white idea. And in order to get at that, a lot of it has to do with stand structure and age. But stand structure is a really key element of that. Certain stands will reach old growth stand structures earlier than other stands, depending on the site productivity and the environment and the climate they're in. So it's really, to me, fundamentally a description of a stand that is old and has a complex stand structure. But at the same time, we don't have that everywhere. So we're stuck with age. And on top of that, old growth structures are going to look very different. And the ages are very different depending on the ecosystem you're in the province. If you're in the pine flats around Quesnel, it's a very different looking old growth stand than what that old growth stand looks like in Port Alberni. I could go on forever there, but I'm going to let the other folks talk.
I agree with what Cam just said completely. In a sense, I think it's almost a red herring because, I almost wonder what the motivation of the question is, because there clearly isn't a simple answer. And I think there are, crucial elements in how you interpret the information that you have. And as we said in our intro, it's really important to look at what you have today in relation to what you had yesterday. So that is a crucial element. And if you have no actual old growth left, for example, in quite a lot of the low elevation ecosystems, there's very little left. There's only stand structural attributes. Well, you have to get what you have and work with that. So defining an arbitrary threshold beyond which you have to cross in order for it to be determined old growth can be extremely counterproductive. I have been in situations where in some of the dry coastal Western hemlock ecosystems, the best remaining stands haven't been considered to cross this arbitrary threshold and have been harvested as a result. So multiple 100-year-old large Douglas fir were harvested, even though they're the last thing there, because they haven't crossed this line, apparently. That to me is perverse. It's a perverse interpretation of the intention, and we have to be really wary of that. So I'm cautious about trying to identify a single line that beyond which you have to cross in order to be conserved. We have to conserve the best of what we have remaining today in order to start to reverse the trend and work back towards ecological health. So I think that is a more useful way to think about definitions.
And thank you for that. Gary, do you want to comment on this one?
The definition that we have now was never built for ecosystem management. It was built for timber management. And so it's just totally, it gives us clues about what is old growth or what's not old growth. But Rachel's observation is you have to think about how the ecosystem functions and the pieces and what pieces need to be there in relative to each other so things can move around. And frankly, I'm not a real fan of this whole notion of OGMAs and old growth management area. When you manage for ecosystem health, you manage a landscape and distribution and connection, connectivity and amount of old attribute type forests, some undisturbed forests where old things live in. You're managing for structure, connection, all those other types of things. It is important that we build a classification system that reflects that a lot better so that we can actually manage for the parameters that we do have. In our recommendation, our first piece of implementation advice was to work with a team of inventory, habitat mapping specialists, and scientific experts in the management of old forests and classification to develop a new classification system for old forests. Something like habitat mapping. And it considers a number of factors. It's not just simple parameters, it's about function. We have a kind of a saying in our community, when beavers come in a valley, the valley gets healthy. And that's because they created something that made the landscape richer, that connected to other things, and next thing you know, the whole valley starts to get healthy. Well, that's kind of the way we have to think about this. So it is true that age and size and those types of things are actually quite a good clues, but they're clues. They're not what it is.
These are all really good points, and another one that I would add is we host the BC Big Tree Registry here at UBC, and of course it is a database for some of the largest trees in the province, but a large tree in and of itself is not an old growth forest with all those old growth attributes. So they absolutely deserve protection. They're monuments in the forest, but protecting just the biggest trees of a species does not get at this issue of protecting functional old growth forests. I'm sorry, my light keeps blinking out on me, so I'll just give up on it. So if we could move on from there, I think Cam mentioned LiDAR, Gary mentioned inventory and the need to come up with new criteria, new categories for really looking at old growth function on the landscape. And one of the questions that got the most upvotes in the last round was, can we go to an old growth policy and management framework model that is based on LiDAR-based enhanced forest inventory and science? So removing inventory questions from politics/NGOs. Can you discuss how the inventory could be improved and the role that LiDAR data might play in that? And let's start with Rachel this time.
Well, I was going to suggest that Cam starts because he's been doing some of this recently. So Cam start, and I can add to that.
Sure.
Okay.
That sounds fair. I just spent the last 5 years of my life at this, so might as well talk. I don't think there's any question that LiDAR will give us a very powerful tool to describe and better identify old growth and in all kinds of other types of forest attributes and terrain attributes across the province. Whether it's tree size, density, stand structure, strength, vertical complexity, LiDAR is an incredibly powerful tool to help us understand the vegetation above the terrain and then the terrain itself. The challenge is that it takes some coordinated, consistent investment and a dedication of that effort by the province to make that happen. And then bridging the world with the VRI, because the province builds a lot of things off of the VRI as it currently is. So we can't just suddenly flip to one versus the other. We are moving in that direction, and definitely a very powerful way to start to think about managing old growth. Although the way the question was phrased made me think that, will that help remove politics from the process? And I'm going to argue it probably won't, because we'll have a better description of where our current condition is, but we still have to make decisions about how we manage the land, which ultimately, in an imperfect world, will involve some level of trade-off or balancing decisions that will take place as part of managing old growth. And I think Gary's report was aimed at trying to take some of that out and hopefully make it more based on ecology, but being a political realist, I think we're never going to take politics out of this discussion.
Yeah, and I support what Cam just said. Then I think, and to end with the final point, I think we need increased public awareness and accountability for what happens in the forest. So taking one section of I've frankly found the question a little biased. So, taking half of the players out of the conversation is not going to help the situation. I think the crucial part is, irrespective of the data, we need to be clear what we are trying to do. So if we aren't clear about the objective, and if everybody is not on the same page about meeting the objectives, it doesn't matter what data level we use. You can play games with any data layer, or you can attempt to really meet the objective that you're trying to do with any data layer. And in the end, we need to be in the field and understanding that we've got what we think we've got and that we haven't been misled by data, and that's the crucial thing. But I really don't think imagining that the data will answer the questions is not going to get us there. I think we really need to be much more clear about what we are trying to achieve with the forest, and then really collectively genuinely work together to that end, because I'm not sure that's been how we've been doing it to date.
Gary, do you want to comment on this one?
Yes, I definitely do, because we had everything we needed to look after the land right, and we had no information. Yeah, and I'm with Rachel. It is a red herring, but we are trying to figure out how to have more of us jammed on the same piece of land and try to make it sustain more of us than maybe what it could if we just kind of lived with it a lot differently and a lot more softer. So yeah, now we're starting to push the edges, and we're trying to figure out how to make it do more than it would have historically or traditionally. But you know, I keep thinking back, and a friend of mine is an archaeologist, and he did a lot of the archaeology work when they built the new 4-lane highway up to Tsawwassen, to the ferry terminal there. He says the estimates are that there was maybe as many as 100,000 people living on that flat sometime during the 12,000 years of occupation. So I say to myself, now I know there's a lot more than that now, but how do 100,000 people live on a piece of land with no police, no lot lines, no sewers, no grocery store, and somehow do it for that long? Like, somehow you got to be living with. So for me, this question, I agree that LiDAR, I agree with that 100, like Cam's, all of his points about being able to see structure and understand what is truly a certain type of ecosystem is way better with LiDAR, because the trees, you can only kind of estimate height and size and stuff with the current methodology we use in the terrain, but you can really start to understand more about particularly wetland ecosystems with LiDAR, stuff like that. But for me, we get trapped in this thing a lot where, you know, I look at the recent Blueberry decision. Now we got to start managing for cumulative effects. So we think we're going to take our Grizzly model, input-output model, and we're going to apply that to a landscape now and manage everything on input-output quantitative model for cumulative effects. I think that's a fool's game, frankly, because it just gets too complicated and there's too many inherent assumptions. We really need to start to put a lot more value, in my mind, on Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, understanding land and what's good and what's not good. And our science can help us with that. But Indigenous knowledge didn't just come out of magic, out of nowhere. It came with repeated observation and changing and learning over time. We just did a little thing on a potential mine in our area, and we built an environmental company where I come from. And we tried to achieve excellence in the blending of local Tahltan knowledge and or local knowledge just in general, and scientific knowledge, because we hire scientists to come in and look at the land, but they can only see what's there now. They haven't had the luxury of having millennia, in some cases, of people living and seeing patterns and passing those patterns down. And we've lost that in a lot of our communities, or parts of it, but lots of it is still there. And that kind of knowledge you just can't get by studying. You really can't, and understanding it. So I just feel like there's a big qualitative element here, like Rachel said, that we really are missing here. That somehow we have to figure out how to blend it into our management system. It's funny because we do it in a lot of our Indigenous plans. It's just normal. In fact, I loved, we had an expert from the North recently, and Rachel was part of this group, who said, I place scientific knowledge second and our Indigenous knowledge is first in building our plans. And I read those plans, and they're just totally, from my perspective, bang on terms of how you have to look after land. Make it less confusing, complicated, overly complicated. I don't know what to use.
And so much of this speaks to learning from the land, not from other sources, and spending that time in these forests to really understand them. And no matter what we might teach people in our classes here, there's nothing that can substitute for that time on the land. So thanks for that, Gary. And I think I want to go to you first for this next question, which is, how do we protect our forests and their biodiversity while achieving fair and just rights and titles for First Nations? And I'd like to just add to that consideration of the announcement that came out from the province last week of reaching agreements on for protection of 1.7 million hectares of land that have been reached with the various First Nations groups around the province. I think maybe 70 different groups. So maybe you could comment on that, how that balance is achieved.
Well, you know, I read this 2 or 3 times thinking, what's the underlying assumption of this? And maybe the only thing, and maybe I'm totally mistaken, but I read that there's this underlying assumption that loss of economic opportunities is an impact to rights and title and exercising it. And I don't see those as the same thing. I really don't. It may be true that we have compromised the land base in some of these territories, but being part of and looking after the land, sharing what's still coming out of it, that's how you respect rights and title. Now, if it's compromised, then you're part of how do we figure out how to restore it? And how do we do all those types of things? That's what respecting rights and title is about. It may be, yeah, now we're down to guts and feathers is the expression, and you're not going to get as much as we got out of it. We can't turn back the clock now. So just moving forward, that's my response to this. The 1.7 hectares that wasn't protected, that's deferrals. That, just to be clear on that, that's a misnomer. That these are 2-year deferrals to give us some chance to build proper ecosystem health plans for those areas and keep on to hold on to the critical elements so that they can be part of that plan. So
yeah, apologies for that. And just to return to your previous point, as new shared resource agreements are met and more decisions on the land base are held by Indigenous people, it will be it's very hopeful to see that traditional ecological knowledge that will then have a way to be that can then be used on the land base. But you're right, the deferrals, these are deferrals, not protection, and the rubber is going to hit the road, so to speak, when those deferral periods end. So these are important conversations to be having now. So to change topics, we had some questions on some issues around forest management and also on use and export of logs. And so,
Sally, do you mind if I just quickly jump in on that one? I feel pretty passionately about this question.
Sorry, I didn't give you a chance.
Yeah, no problem. The question's an interesting one, but it's the answer is, it's not one or the other, it's one and the same. If we give First Nations the opportunity to help guide management in forests and be part of that process, we're going to get good outcomes for the forest. We're going to get good outcomes for First Nations. And we implement shared decision making on our resource lands. That's how we implement DRIPA in the province. We have examples of that now where I think Robert Dennis spoke to a really good example of that on TFO 44. There's other forest landscape plans going on around the province where they're at the table helping make decisions about how to manage the land. And when I was at the Hawaii Old Growth Summit, in between our meetings here, Robert Dennis made a really compelling case that, they've been there for thousands of years. They tend to be there for another 1,000 years. While he is an elected chief, maybe at times tempted to create economic revenue for his people as part of management, he has a long-term view, and he has 5 or 7 hereditary chiefs around him. They keep him focused on a long-term view of managing that land for a sustained generation. So I just have a lot of faith that the way forward to resolve issues with First Nations and implement DRIP in their province to get them deeply involved in forest management.
Thanks for that, Cam. And it's too bad that we don't have Chief Robert Dennis here today. But again, you can go to his recording from the last round and hear his words of wisdom around these issues. So Rachel, did you want to comment on this one?
There's lots to say in there. I think it's really complicated. I think people are being put in a very difficult position, and I think that's very, very problematic. We're all humans on the planet, irrespective, and the biodiversity and climate crises are going to hit us all, irrespective of where we're from. And I think that's the underlying thing that we need to remember collectively. I mean, it's what I think about, and yeah, I could go from there, but we'll just leave it at that.
And we'll be talking about climate change and biodiversity a little later in the questions, and this will come back up for sure. I'd like to move on to a question about log exports. And the question that came from the audience member was, why haven't raw log exports been banned? I realize none of you have control over that question, but how can BC stimulate a value-added economy that is better for local communities? And if you could tie that in with old growth, since that's our focus today, that would be helpful. Who would like to start on this one?
Start if you like. So let's talk about exports first. So, raw log exports in BC are predominantly coming from private lands. The amount of raw log exports off public lands is really quite small. If you look at Teal Jones on the coast that we're involved in Dry Creek, they have 0 log exports. Western Forest Products probably has, about 5% of their logs might hit an export market. It's a very small issue on Crown lands. Where it is occurring, it's occurring because there's a much higher value for that log somewhere else. And that higher value often makes a particular harvest opportunity viable where it might not otherwise have been, which supports local communities. So I think it's anything, if you think about moderation, there's good and there's bad associated with raw log exports. I fully support this idea of value added inside BC, but the absolute ban of raw log exports seems just too black and white. It's too simple of an answer. I think there's a role, and it's still it's a pretty small issue right now. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Well, actually, so this idea about creating value-added economy and old growth, I'll just quickly speak to that. So I think the single biggest impact we've had to our economic engine here in BC has been around this value-added sector when we talk about old growth. They highly depend on old growth stands. So we absolutely need to protect an ecosystem health and manage for that, but we have to find ways to make some of these very specialized products available, potentially on small scales, to these value-added processors. We've got folks on the coast that are actually shutting down lines in value-added sectors because they can't access old growth stands because BCTS has stopped putting out old growth in many cases on the coast. So it's a key piece. The old growth is directly linked to value-added. Value-added, it can't be produced as a snapshot. You need a mixture of manufacturing to make value-added work. Not every log or every tree in a stand is suitable for value-added. So you really need that suite of pulp, saw log, and value-added coming together to work as a collective industry.
I would just add that it's more than just raw log exports. There is export of green timber that's not manufactured, and that's what we do. We make boards, we make simple things. We haven't moved that next step. I've talked to quite a lot of value-added folks who tell me that yes, the really high value products are often old growth associated, but across Europe they make a whole bunch of products, and we're starting to do it here. The mass timber issue and that aren't old growth related, and that's where we have to go. I said it before and I'll say it again, harvesting ancient or very old trees has never been sustainable. We cannot build a sustainable industry off harvesting things that are 250 plus or 140 plus and thinking that we could keep doing that. We've never planned to keep doing that. We always have planned to liquidate that forest and move on to a second growth. So what was the plan? I mean, that's the problem, that we've never put in place the plan that we've known needed to be there for the last 40 years. So blaming it now on protection of old is ridiculous. It's been a short-sighted lack of moving this forward. We started the transition 30 years ago, and then it got curtailed and we went a different way. We went to a volume-based move, and now we have to really work hard to bring it back. And that's the point at which I'm not the economics expert, but it's very clear that we need to significantly kick that in the pants and really change, incentivize the ability to really make that switch. And we need to do it soon if we want to keep the jobs associated with the forest industry, because the total volume is declining no matter how you look at it, with old growth protection or not. It's always been going to decline. It's always been declining. We're close to the bottom of that transition from a first to a second growth economy.
There are some exciting potential value-added products that are hopefully going to come on stream in a big way in the near future, coming from the bioproducts industry, focusing on waste biomass, not prime old growth timber, but creating all kinds of low carbon substitutes for fossil fuels and other materials out of the building blocks of wood. So that is an area that might be able to use a wide range of material that's not suitable for other purposes and not old growth. Gary, do you want to comment on this one?
When you look at it on the surface, it may show that this is not a big deal, raw log exports, but there is a lot of loopholes in this system. And Rachel alluded to one of them: cut the side off a log and export it, or make it a big cant, or all green, or whatever. And we have a significant volume of that. There is a lot of ways of manipulating this system to promote that. And I spent a lot of time with the lumber manufacturers on this one, particularly the small ones, because they get the brunt of this stick all the time. They don't have the power to fight and to survive in this. And unfortunately, you actually have to do some real active policy work in the stumpage system itself, in the Category 2 value added, to fix all those little loopholes and links that don't support the smaller people as well as they could. And it is true, our definition of value added, there's no question that there's a huge value added industry around old growth timber. I wouldn't characterize it as huge. There's Western has a huge line of value added that comes out of old growth. But I really loved a lot of the mills, the smaller processors that we visited, who would take a few loads and turn into just absolutely amazing products and employ a huge number of people. And those were the most fun for me. That is the ones that we are trying to support in this province. But every time we go through a consolidation in the sector, it's always the smaller people who get pushed out, because the big people have the pockets to outlast them and buy them out, basically. The forest industry is an industry of the last man standing. If I can outlast the person beside me by even a day, I might make it, or a week. And if you've got deep pockets, your ability to do that is better without public intervention to favor the smaller people versus too many loopholes. I spent a lot of time with the smaller operators, and they have a lot of ideas on how to fix this. And frankly, I wouldn't do it justice to try to repeat them all, but there is a lot of thought has gone into this by the manufacturing sector itself. And my thought is maybe we need to start using them to help self-police themselves so that we actually get the results we.
Thank you for that. Another area that needs policy work.
Yeah,
There's no
I just have to, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Sally.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just need to comment on the biomass comment, just because, you know, we need to be really wary of that from a jobs perspective, that if you want to go the wrong direction, put all your effort into developing mills that don't have any people in them, because that's your biomass. You're pretty much going the squarely wrong direction from actually getting value out of the forest. And there's potential around the use of waste, but there's significant flaws. It's a big global conversation right now in terms of replacing fossil fuels. That is going to sink us if we aren't careful globally. So that is a real issue. So I think you didn't mean that in your comment, but I just need to flag that.
No, that's an important point, and I certainly wasn't talking, for example, about the pellet industry in particular. But I don't want to get into that. So, the next question on the list is, why hasn't clear-cut logging been banned? Isn't selective logging better for the environment? So I welcome any of you to comment on harvesting systems, and recognizing that there's a huge range of forests in the province, and there is a range of practices out there, but how can those be improved? And who would like to go first on that one? Maybe Cam?
Sure. I think we need to be pretty careful with definitions here. You know, we create openings through harvesting and leave nothing behind. I'd call that clear cutting. When we create openings and retain patches and individual trees in that opening, then I'd call it variable retention or a clear cut with retention. To me, there's a big difference there. There's a spectrum of types of that kind of harvesting in BC, ranging for the amount of retention that's left. You know, selective harvesting is really retaining the majority of those stems on the site. But you know, clear cutting with retention is absolutely ecologically appropriate in many forest stands in BC. And it's a tool in the forester's tool belt. You're certainly not going to ban it or take it away. It's a critical tool in the tool belt. I think, in fairness, it should be recognized it's probably the most economic way to harvest timber and regenerate areas. So when multiple ecological options are available, we tend to create openings as opposed to selectively harvest. But really, again, it's like this raw log thing. It's black and white issues. It's not a black and white issue, and we're not going to get a black and white solution to this. There are appropriate times and methods for creating openings in BC's forests, and what we really need to focus on is ensuring appropriate levels of structure are retained within openings to help lifeboat biodiversity, help us create you know, better biodiversity within the managed stands that we do create.
Gary, do you want to take a shot at this one?
This is yeah, I don't know what I'd say more than what Cam's. I was going to say this earlier. We have a relatively simple natural disturbance type model in British Columbia, and similar to our old growth, that system needs to be looked at. Nature doesn't really do clear cuts like we do clear cuts at all. You go in after a fire, and it's very rare that you see anything that looks even close to a clear cut. And so even in a boreal forest, I have a good friend in Alberta who taught his fellow bunchers how to mimic boreal forest patterns. And you go in, it's a patchwork. And when you come back at 2 or 3 years later, they look fundamentally different. And so for us, yeah, there's clearing, but we in recommendation 12, I think it was, of the report, advocated that we have mandatory silviculture systems tied to NDT types, and that we refine the NDT system. And what that does, a lot of people are worried that this is going to cause extra cost and we can't afford it. Well, we work on a competitive stumpage system. So what it means now is if that's mandatory for that type, people will bid that prescription. And so we will change the norm, basically, is what we will do. It'll just automatically include the extra cost. And we do have to retain the integrity of the competitive based stumpage system. We shouldn't be building grants and kickbacks in there because it invokes the whole softwood lumber dispute problem. But we can find ways to make it do what we want and still keep it competitive. And that is how you do it.
Very good points.
Yeah. I would only add that we're supposed to be emulating natural disturbances. We certainly have not been doing that, even with the clear-cut notion, as Gary said. One of the key things that we do in the province is soil disturbance, and that has not been accounted for adequately in carbon models and in thinking about what we're managing the forest for. And I think that's going to be a really key thing going forward. There is a whole bunch of joint benefits associated with partial harvesting that have people on the ground, that reduce soil disturbance, and so getting the big machines out of there so that you're not releasing 60% of your soil carbon into the atmosphere as you're harvesting. We desperately need to be doing that. So we need to create more jobs. I mean, we're saying that all of these things we need to do. And if we went to a predominantly partial harvesting system, we could also reduce fire risk on the site, leave the right structure, reduce biodiversity risk, keep the ground cool, all of those things. But they all require the paradigm shift because each piece requires the enabling economic pieces, as Gary said. And they also need that change in what we're doing. We need to leave the large fir on the site instead of predominantly, taking out the large fir from the site. We need to leave those structures that we have historically gone in and focused on removing. Those are the things that we need to keep there to promote resilience and jobs in the future. And that takes a whole bunch of shift. And there are local operators who are doing that. I've seen some local examples of that too. We need to truly incentivize it, and we need to truly disincentivize the historic way of doing things and shift. And then we could solve a whole bunch of problems at the same time.
Thanks for that, Rachel. And you bring up soil carbon, and that's a great segue into our next and last set of questions here, which relate to climate change and old growth forests. And so the first question that was posed again from the previous session was Checamus and Mosaic recently stated they are making more money from carbon credits than logging old growth. This is on specific areas of forest, of course. Can panelists speak to the economic opportunity conserving old growth for carbon credits? Would anyone like to start on that one?
I have a couple of general comments. In the big picture, we need to start to value the forest for all its resources. We just happen to have monetized carbon. So yes, we could zoom down that path, but we actually need to understand that we need to pay for the forest to keep the water cool, to maintain slope stability. That is step number one. We need to think broadly about the ecosystem services and actually pay for them. I'm sure pretty much everybody in their undergraduate we need to stop externalizing the costs of actions on the planet. That is the shift that we need to make. So starting there, we need to do that. The second piece is, I think there is clearly a massive potential to help pay for conservation of the forest through carbon credits. And like pellets and like taking fossil fuels offline, it can be done well or it can be done badly. I'm hearing the phrase carbon cowboy running around out there. You know, there is a huge opportunity and there is a huge ability to fiddle with it. So I think the devil will be in the details, like all of these pieces. But there's the potential for a very large sum of money to hit British Columbia to keep these forests standing is very much there. So there is an opportunity that is increasing all the time as the price of carbon increases. And if people should, I highly recommend taking stock of that. It's interesting to see that Mosaic was one of the first to do that on a relatively big scale. So yes, it's there, it's coming, it's only going to get bigger.
And certainly this ties in with disturbance types, because the potential for storing carbon in ecosystems is going to depend on long intervals between major disturbances.
That's a really good point, Sally. It's not the right prescription everywhere, and there's a couple of key factors here. You know, Mosaic primarily works on private land. This is much simpler on private land where you have clear ownership of the carbon. You know, if you look at the carbon market today, the economics of carbon credits really only work for stands that are relatively marginal on timber values. And you know, as carbon prices rise over time, we could definitely see more stands being fit into the, if it's purely made on an economic decision, we could see that change a bit over time, unless timber prices also rise. But you know, one of the key challenges, and none of this stuff is simple, but a really key challenge is that, you know, wood is a really climate-friendly building product relative to steel and concrete. So there's a demand in the marketplace, with or without it. It's even more so because of the fact that it's a climate-friendly building product. So if you think about, you know, if we start to set aside and reserve a lot of forests for carbon credits, there will be less emissions going into the atmosphere from the forests where we preserve them. But does the demand for wood actually change? And so where does that wood come from, in the likelihood that it doesn't change unless we price it out of competition, and then we get concrete and steel coming back in to take over? So we have to be really cautious about this idea of, if I set a stand aside in BC to reduce emissions, which is real, that it just doesn't get logged somewhere else, and that emissions still occur in a less regulated part of the world. So it's a complex topic.
And I would just reflect from that. I totally agree with the concrete steel comment, Cam. That's a real issue. We have to be really wary of the extent to which forests are a climate-friendly solution. However, because a 1,000-year-old forest or a 10,000-year-old forest has phenomenal levels of carbon storage, and 200-year-old and 100-year-old primary forests also do. We do not account for that correctly at this point. We leave soil carbon out of the budgets. We don't look at those trends. We have to be really wary of playing games with the math around what carbon friendly actually means. You know, by all accounts, the models say, you know, that we have 10 years to get this under control if we're not already past that point. Forests are only carbon neutral over hundreds of years, and so it is a game to say that. And although I agree relative to concrete and steel that forests are definitely a better option, we need to be really careful that we have done the math correctly on that, and we're not misrepresenting how the forest plays from a climate perspective.
I'd like to just make a comment here without my moderator hat on, but it's tremendously important that we have full carbon accounting including the soil, as you point out, Rachel, which we don't know nearly enough about. And also on the wood product side, if we're saying we've got carbon friendly materials, we have to have full life cycle analysis on that. Where's the wood going? Where are different parts of the log going, and what are the long-term implications? So it is a very tricky matter, and easy to just assume that the nature-based solution of the forest will save us from our emissions.
But conceptually, it can be quite simple. If you maintain a steady state of carbon, if you sustainably manage a forest and you have a steady state of carbon in your forest, and you're continually spinning out wood products that are used in environmentally friendly locations, that can be a very positive outcome. Now, that's a vast oversimplification of what reality is on varying ecosystems around the province, but that's ultimately the goal: sustainably managed, well-managed forest with stable carbon, spitting out wood products that help us live.
Gary.
Oh, this one, I'm always amused by these questions around jobs and carbon, because they're both the same thing in a sense. And we have this really deep timber bias in British Columbia. We kind of externalize everything. I argue about the 100 timber jobs that I'm saving, but I don't speak about the 200 other sector jobs that I displaced and the possible millions of dollars I cost this municipality, and all those other costs, we just externalize them. So that is a very similar issue. I can't tell you how many times we heard about the hidden costs of the way we're doing business now that we're not talking about at all. We just somehow assume that timber is the center of the world and everything about it we need to protect, and we can kind of ignore all the rest of that stuff. It's just a deeply rooted mentality. We've got 200 years with this business. We built British Columbia on it. It's part of our inherent, it's like Alberta with oil and gas. It's just the same bias. And I'm not suggesting that it's not important, but it's really hard to have an informed conversation when you're leaving out most of the information you need to make informed decisions. Carbon is exactly the same thing. Our inherent bias is very poor accounting on carbon, and fires, it's incredible. Like, we were using 100% loss of carbon for fires, and I look at the recent research now, that piece you've probably seen at Sally from down in the States. De Silva sent it to me, all of the most recent pieces where they did multiple case studies. We're underestimating our carbon loss in logging by up to 75%. And we're overestimating our carbon loss from fires by up to 95%. Using the current stuff. And it's because we really never even questioned it. We just somehow made an assumption, ignored all the other pieces, and just kind of ran away with it. And so we will get there once we start to think a little differently about forests, and once we start moving more to thinking about ecosystems, we'll build the proper methodologies. But right now we're stuck in a place where we have a bit of blinders on all the time.
I see a lot of students in the audience, and graduate students, and in case they thought we had run out of things that we need to understand better about forests, there's still no shortage, and there's so many gaps. Moving along to biodiversity and carbon storage question. Actually, first, just a climate change question. So climate change will induce new stressors that may jeopardize the ability to conserve old growth as it is today, in quotes from the participant. Is this a problem? So what will be the impact of climate change on the old growth that we conserve in the long term? And is that a problem, is the question. Rachel, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. Yeah, it's a problem. It's one of 1,000 problems that we are faced with. And I also wondered about where this question was intended to go from the participant. I hear all the time, oh no, climate change means we can't conserve old growth, and it's ridiculous in terms of an argument, in my view. I think the thing that we know about climate change is that we are getting increased mortality, and that is problematic, and which should be frightening to us. At every stage of forest management, we have a large number of young silviculture plots that are dead or dying as a result of the increased stresses. We need to manage that by not throwing out history, and as we log a mature stand, climate change hits the ground right away. So we need to maintain our existing old growth. If something has survived the last 250 years of fires, it has at least a reasonable betting odds probability of surviving the next ones. And planning to try to, I certainly agree that in our forest management, we need to be thinking about how the future climate should influence how we're planting and what we're trying to create as a stand. But the notion that we are going to get rid of existing old growth in order to, because we're worried about climate change, makes absolutely no sense to me at all.
Gary, do you want to take on that one?
I mean, I'm with Rachel on this. I struggle with that logic. You manage for unforeseen or large-scale impacts is to maintain as much resilience as you can in your forest. True that is possible, and maybe 100 years climate will be so extreme that will just wipe those things out. Having said that, then you know what? I guess if we're going to do that, then piss on it. Let's all just go and buy a gas guzzling diesel, and let's just cut it all down. Let's just all go to hell in a handbasket together. I mean, if you're going to have that thing, let's just give up now. That's just retarded from my perspective. I can't even get my mind around that thinking. I'm too much of an optimist.
I'll offer maybe just a slightly different perspective on that one. I think the key word in that question is conserve old growth. Climate change, the single biggest impact we're going to experience from climate change in interior BC is increased fire and area burned. So, our approach to forest management has to integrate fire and fire risk into our management approaches. Simply identifying old growth areas, putting a fence around them, assuming they're going to remain there for 100 years, as you mentioned earlier, Sally, is pretty unrealistic. So in dynamic ecosystems that experience fire and are expected to experience even more fire, we need different management approaches. So it could be long rotations that we're managing for both mature and old as a function of long rotations. It's dynamic over the landscape. We're still talking about 100 plus over years to maintain old growth. But just the idea of putting a fence around old growth like you would do on a very wet coastal site is just folly in many ways in the interior. I mean, certainly in short timeframes, we're thinking about, hey, where are we managing for old growth? But it's part of a long cycle of maybe a longer rotation. It's a different approach to forest management.
I think the problem is, though, that the implication of what you just said gets taken to say, and we don't have to keep any of it now then, because that's the implication. So in our lifetimes, the things that we do and set up as management strategies, they're not going to be doing any of them in 40 or 60 or 100 years time, and we're lucky. Hopefully they're doing something at that point. But to me, the problem with that argument suggests that we don't need that old growth to be maintained now, and clearly we do, plus more, because we know that we're going to lose more than we originally anticipated. And I know that in parts of the province, they have indeed given up, as Gary just said, and decided that they don't want their old growth to be maintained anymore. It's deeply concerning to me. that strategy is in fact being implemented in different parts of the province right now, using it's not what you meant, Cam, but it is what that logic, you can't put a fence around it, says, okay, well, I'm not going to put a fence around it, I'm going to log it. And that's what happens. That's what the alternative that is happening now. So we clearly need to put a fence around it for a period of time. And yes, it will be dynamic on the land base. We won't be able to stop that from happening, but we need to actually plan enough fenced old growth so that there is something to be dynamic across the land base over time. If we've the key thing that we don't do is manage enough so that we actually can turn it over time when it does burn. And that's, we need to, I agree that we can put that strategy together with a partial harvesting strategy across mature forest and maintain reduce the overall fire risk. But to jump to, and therefore we don't have to protect old growth, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, certainly wasn't implying that.
Yeah. We do research on what we should be planting when we plant trees, given climate change, and it alarms me. So once in a while, there is a question that says, well, if we're planting things for new climates, then doesn't that mean that the old growth, that the trees that are already there are not going to fare well or should just be harvested? And that, of course, is not the case. So this actually leads to one of the other questions which is it possible to regrow old growth values from a clear cut in 250 years? And there's a climate change piece in this answer, I think, as well.
I'll jump in.
Oh, Pam, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess the interesting part of that question is grow old growth values from a clear cut in 250 years. We can certainly produce lichen in 250 years. We can certainly produce mammoo habitat in 250 years. We can produce a lot of stand structures in 250 years. Can we reproduce the structure of a 600 or 1,000-year-old stand? Absolutely not. Those are critical, complex stands that take extended periods of time. So it's about being clear about what are the values we're managing for, and how much of that area do we need to maintain across an ecosystem to maintain biodiversity. I think the question infers it's quite simple, but I think it's a bit more complex.
Yeah, I agree. We can generate attributes slowly over time. It depends on the ecosystem, but we will not get those older forests and all the structures and all the functions and all the biodiversity likely in such a short period of time. And the bottom line is that we don't know, and maybe we're going to find out. But it would be an awful lot better to be starting from a partial harvested stand where you have not disturbed the soil. Then you'd be much further along in that process. And I think there would be a lot to be gained from thinking about long rotations based on a partially harvested stand if you want recovery of attributes over time.
Okay, good discussion on that one. Gary, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I want to actually give the answer that a young scientist gave to us on the old growth panel, because I thought it was quite brilliant, frankly. Well, there's two sets of scientists on this one. The first one was, it's possible maybe to get some of the attributes back. There's no question about that. But that would be the exception. It's definitely not the rule. When you, for example, I look at this, I have an old growth cottonwood stand that covers most of the valley right across from where, like, I live in the valley here. If you clear cut that whole thing, those trees all pump, some of them can be a few thousand gallons a day. The water table comes up, and it takes quite a few years for it to even get enough soil back to make a new ecosystem. And the oldest trees in there are probably only 250. So it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have a stand like that in 250. But It really depends on how much of what you retained after your clear cut. Like we have an assumption about what a clear cut is, right? If you are doing something that more is akin to boreal forest fire pattern with a light broadcast burning, you took a lot of trees, it's very likely you're going to have old growth for that boreal ecosystem back there in, I don't know, 100, 150 years potentially. Maybe 250 for sure. You're going to have a lot of the same structural things. In a temperate forest, it takes 300 years for some of the mushrooms and stuff to form. Some of the species that we see in some of the really old stands don't come in for quite a few hundred years. So I guess it just depends on what you're trying to do with it. The thought that these are renewable is actually a mistake because they aren't. The other part of this is those things came through a whole history of humans at this level not even being on North America to now they've got a whole history of climate change and fossil fuels and every other thing ahead of us that they got to deal with. So whatever comes out of that far end is not going to look anything like what comes out of this end of what we're seeing right now, because it's got a whole different set of factors that it's got to deal with. So yeah, it would be the exception rather than the rule. We can actually do that. We might be able to get back some of the avenues, depending on how big these new factors that we've created.
There's so many ecological contingencies, factors leading to what develops, and climate change affecting those. So I hear a fair amount of agreement across that we're not going to see forests like the oldest forests we have now, starting from scratch, and really some of those attributes will come back, but not the forests themselves. So thoughtful answers on that. Last question, we're about to wrap up. The last question is, how much old growth should be set aside by 2030? I think that's based on a carbon target, 2030, for biodiversity and carbon storage. That's a very large question that I think Gary and Rachel and the technical committee have been trying to address, and I'm sure Cam has thoughts on. So if you could just briefly address how we might get to that number or numbers.
Well,
Ray, do you want to start?
I mean, I would comment that we can set aside 70% old growth and have the wrong 70%. So an actual number is not helpful in that sense. So it is always possible to not do this well. We think from a conservation science perspective that 30% of total ecosystems is high risk, and that to get into a low risk situation, you need to be 50+% of your land base managed for the values such as biodiversity and carbon. And so we need to do that, and we need to overrepresent the old, as we said in our canonized document, because based on what's there now, we've lost such a lot of it. So to me, we could move a long way forward with even a relatively small number if we started to do it right. And that is the critical part to me in terms of the answer. So, you know, I hear all the time, oh, we've set aside X and it's a big number. Well, is that meaningful? I don't know. Did it change anything? I don't know. If it didn't create change, then we haven't undone the problem as we started at the beginning of this. So to me, that's the answer that I would give.
Cam, do you want to go ahead? I'm going to give Gary the last word on this one.
Sure. That's a challenging question. I think, as Rachel mentioned, this idea of some percentage of natural old growth that exist on the land base is a good measure to assess that. In our document up front, we said that in some areas of land base, we're going to be managing for a lower level of biodiversity, which may be down in the 30 or less percent. In other areas, we're going to be managing for higher biodiversity, which could be up in the 50% range. I think it's important just to make the case that in 1995, the Biodiversity Guidebook was created to support the Forest Practices Code, and in that book, it represents a pretty strong foundation for what is possible. It was never fully implemented, but the parts that are largely consistent with what we're talking about here. Now, areas of low biodiversity were certainly cut back to support timber supply, and we need to revisit that. But areas of intermediate and high biodiversity are largely consistent with what I would think are appropriate levels of old growth retention already. So it's about the degree of change. In some cases, it's non-trivial, and in some cases, it might not be that significant. I agree there is a paradigm shift, and we need to be thinking about, how much and where. It's not just about any trees to be set aside for old growth. It's the right trees to be set aside to protect biodiversity, and what we're doing inside the managed land base and the matrix as well to make sure we're addressing both those stand level issues and the landscape level issues. So again, tough question to answer. I have a lot of faith in First Nations that'll help us figure that out.
On that note, Gary, could you add a comment on that?
Well, I think the question, I just feel like the question is framed wrong, because and I just feel like, and I know what the assumption is. It feels to me, and I could be totally wrong, that the assumption under this is the rest of it we can just do whatever with. But that's not how you do ecosystem management. That is not how you manage for healthy ecosystems on a landscape. Landscapes have a certain amount of inherently occurring old growth within some range of variation, and we should try to be managing to roughly the middle of that effective old growth, connected reasonably well across the landscape. Some of it needs to be kept in intact stands for stand-dependent species. So a lot of it can be managed for attribute-dependent species, and it's very site-specific. But again, I just think it's way oversimplifying the conversation to say that. And Kevin's right, the Biodiversity Guidebook kind of gave us some clues on that. I would say we went about halfway. I would say that we'd be way better at doing this right now if we had implemented that fuller, and if we had built in the recommended adaptive management component of this. We're all just kind of guessing right now. You're talking to a lot of people who, in theory, know a lot about this stuff because we've all seen things, we've worked with people, but we are truly just trying to give our best estimate of what might work right now. What we're going to learn very quickly, probably in less than 10 to 20 years, is, oh, that's not really working as well as we thought, but we're not clear on the outcome. For me, it's more about the outcome that we're trying to achieve here. How do I retain connectivity? How do I retain landscape resilience? How do I stay within the inherent range of variability and keep the ecosystems connected and healthy? For me, that's the conversation. It's very variable across the landscape. It's not about administrative boundaries. It's about ecosystems and how they work in these natural disturbance patterns. So that I feel like these conversations all just push us to the notion of it's like the protection or not protect conversation. If I protect this, I can do whatever I want over here. That's not the conversation. That's not how you look after land. Right.
Yeah.
Dummies it down too much.
Yeah, it's so true, Gary. And I think that's where you're 3-zone framework for management on the land base that considers all of these factors, including biodiversity, carbon, timber production, old growth protection. It's not a simple question. I really appreciate all of your time and thoughts along these lines. Brings to mind Fred Bunnell, who's a retired professor from our faculty, who's once said, forestry isn't rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. And questions around old growth and around the management and the need to have a major shift in forest management in BC really bring that to light. Thank you so much to the three of you. I particularly want to thank Rachel and Cam for their efforts to really find that common ground. And I think we saw a lot of common ground today, heard a lot of common ground, and we heard about the challenges left. Those of you in the audience, thanks for joining us. And thanks to Debbie, Michelle, and others for being behind the scenes organizing this event. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.